You're listening to the Music Book Podcast with your host, Marc Masters.
Hey, thanks for checking out the Music Book Podcast. I'm Marc Masters. Written 2 books about music, No Wave, published in 2008, and High Bias, The Distorted History of the Cassette Tape, published in 2023. On this podcast, I talk to music book authors about how they get from their first idea to a finished book and all the decisions they make along the way. So we're still on our every week schedule here. Hope you've been enjoying the stuff we've had lately. We're going to do that for a little while at least. Maybe go back to every other week eventually, but we've got a lot of good books and a lot of good talks coming up. This time around, I talked to 2 authors, Peter J. Woods and John Melillo. Peter's an assistant professor in learning sciences at the University of Nottingham in England. John's an associate professor of English at the University of Arizona. They've both written academic books about noise. Woods is called Learning Through Noise, released in early 2025 by Palgrave Macmillan, and Melillo's is The Poetics of Noise from Dada to Punk, released in 2020 by Bloomsbury Academic as part of their Sound Studies series. Woods' book examines noise as a potential vehicle for education because, quote, noise music as a distinctive musical genre relies on the production of unique learning ecologies and vice versa. Melillo's book looks at 20th century poetry through the lens of noise, quote, constructing a literary history of noise through poetic sound and performance, and tracing how poets figure noise in the disfiguration of poetic voice. Both of these books include lots of concrete examples, including sections on particular artists, scenes, and releases, but they're also very complex philosophically and analytically. I thought it would be cool to talk to both Peter and John at the same time about how they approach something as abstract as noise through academic analysis, and talk about the aspects of writing academic books that are unique in ways both challenging and productive. Peter and John are both musicians themselves as well as show organizers, so they both bring more than just academic experience to the subject. Any questions or comments, email me at musicbookpodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram at the Music Book Podcast, and on YouTube, just search for the Music Book Podcast, and we put audio-only versions of our episodes up there too. So here is my conversation with Peter J. Woods and John Melillo. Hope you enjoy it. Well, I thought we'd just start with like a quick sort of history of how each of you had the idea for the book and decided it could be an idea that would work for a book. I guess, Peter, if you want to start, that'd be cool. Or...
Yeah, I can do that.
Cool.
So this book came out of my dissertation research when I was doing my PhD, and I knew kind of going into the start of the PhD, I wanted to do something with DIY music and education, generally speaking. You know, a big reason that I went back to grad school was sort of this, at the time I had these sort of 2 parallels that were happening in my life. I was a classroom teacher. I was teaching high school math on my day-to-day, but then also playing in bands and making noise music and all these kinds of things at the same time. Was getting burnt out with teaching, had to figure out what to do next if I didn't want to make this my career. Kind of had this interesting comparison in my head where it's like, well, the things that I want to be able to do as a teacher, I'm not able to do because there's all these like social structures and schools being regulated spaces and all these kinds of things. And, how much can you get away with doing weird stuff in the math classroom to begin with? And then on the flip side, it was like I was in these DIY spaces, I was going to shows, I was going on tour and talking to a lot of people that were seeing DIY music, generally speaking, as sort of a space for critical thinking and creativity and identity development and all these kinds of things, but not actually thinking about them as educational spaces as well. At which point I have an idea for a PhD, so I'm going to go back and do it. And so I start doing that, and obviously noise music has been just a part of my life. This past November was 20 years of me playing and making music and running labels and all those kinds of things. And so for my dissertation, I just started running workshops in Milwaukee where just asking people to come and just, you've got an hour, teach whatever you want, do it however you want, and then as an opportunity just to talk to people and things like that. And so the book comes out of the dissertation, and a lot of it is just like all of the things I was kind of thinking about as I was doing that work, and just like being like, I've got a bit of an arc that I want to talk about. There's a bunch of chapters in here that I couldn't actually fit into my dissertation that I want to get out into the world. Yeah, and so it just became this space to really dig into that idea of the connections between learning and DIY music and noise music specifically. and that's where we're at now.
That's cool. Yeah, you mentioned the sort of putting on doing shows and performances and talking to people there. It was a funny experience because somewhere in the halfway point of your book, you describe a performance where a guy is running in place and someone else keeps putting percussion. And I'm like, wow, I wonder if that's anywhere. So I look it up on YouTube. Not only is it there, but you're standing there taking notes in the video, which is like, boy, only in modern life could I have seen like the book in action as I was reading it. That was pretty cool. And John, you want to give us your little origin story here?
Cool. Yeah, in a similar way, the book itself, the immediate cause sort of emerged out of dissertation and PhD time. I have a sort of different trajectory in the sense that my coming to noise music was I think like was belated and yet excited in the sense that I often tell this story to my students in my class. So that I came to noise music via the kind of like gateway drug of like Nirvana, to Sonic Youth, Mare's Bow, sort of like that kind of like trajectory of sort of like looking up the sources and being like, oh, what is this actually, and trying to kind of like spread out or move back in that way. When I started thinking about the book, which was sort of many years in the making in terms of like finding this and finding that, sort of connecting this question of what is poetry, and particularly what are these alternative versions of poetry that emerged in the 21st century, and how are there ways to kind of think of putting them together that over time it became very, I'm using my hands a lot, which is not good for a podcast, but very grab bag, in the sense that there are a lot of different genres, a lot of different kinds of poetic effects that seem to connect with noise. And so I found myself sort of creating what I think is Dickens described in novels as the loose, baggy monster. But noise becomes the connector and the thread through this kind of like alternative history of 20th century, and then into 21st century poetry. For me, the emergence into like and connection with DIY was also, I was really interested when I was beginning to start to make noise music and just be fascinated by the whole world of noise music, understand its connection to a long history of avant-garde production, right? So going back to the Dadaists especially, and up through forms of like downtown New York scene making, you've talked about this on the podcast before, and sort of that kind of long history of how DIY culture has emerged out of sort of print culture and out of performance art was really fascinating to me. And I feel like that's a parallel story with the actual aesthetic effect of noise too. Noise is made at the same time that you're inside of these scenes where people are creating new audiences and new possibilities for what those audiences could even listen to. So yeah, I just became fascinated kind of going backwards in time, finding the roots of things.
Cool. So a lot of times on this show, I talk about process and things like that. So I'm curious a little bit about what the process is, not necessarily in terms of getting the book accepted, or I'd be interested in that too, but like there are certain expectations, I guess, with an academic book that are different from a non-academic book, although there's lots of overlap and blurs there and stuff. But I mean, it strikes me that like a lot of times in an academic book, part of what you're thinking of it as is a sort of a conversation with previous writing on the subject or previous philosophizing, and a lot of references to that. Also a decent bit of like setting out your goals as you're going along and explaining a decent bit of like, here's my argument's going to be this and things like that. Are those also sort of just the standard things that you are you expected to do? Do you try to play with those things a little bit as you're writing? And I also curious, what do you think are the strengths of academic writing in terms of like dealing with a subject like noise? Like, I think most writing I've ever read about noise has been fanzine writing and website writing where people are being, kind of visceral about it and reactions, and almost like not really very often in a conversation with other people. It's very much just my personal reaction to noise and things like that. So, and that's got its place. But I'm curious, what maybe the thrust of my question is, what are your expectations when you're writing an academic book, either internal or external? And then how do you think those you were able to use those as things that could find something out about the subject that you might not have otherwise? It's kind of a verbose question, but take it however you want.
Well, there's always the dreaded second reader in academic writing.
Uh-huh.
There's always there's always that when you send things out for peer review, there's always that second reader who's one who says this is bad because X, Y, and Z.
Uh-huh.
And I think we have a kind of perhaps too much in academia, a sense of that sort of dread of the other, that reader that says, well, what about this? What about this? Who did you read? What did you
Right.
And so there is a certain sort of mania for citation. But for me, on the other hand, I think that the academic writing, I think the benefit of it, and Peter, you may agree or disagree here, and I'm curious to know what you think, is I think that it does acknowledge so much of that this has been thought before. And so, like you said, so often, there's like kind of a visceral reaction to things, which is a really powerful and personal and important reaction. But so often, the ways of representing that are caught up in actually histories that go, that extend into the past. And so, like, acknowledging that, I think, is really important in order to try to sort of have some sense of like, okay, well, we have this like set of past assumptions, and how do we then make new knowledge out of it or produce something new in relationship to that? At the same time, I think that there's something really powerful about like repetition. So not saying that like we have to know history in order to never repeat anything ever again.
Right. Sure.
That kind of avant-garde paradox, where it's like we have to make it new only, but rather there is something really powerful about like saying, like resting within a scene, say, and like letting things play out that, oh, that has been done before, but not in this particular kind of way.
Right.
Anyway, that's getting a little bit further away from
No, it makes
academic
sense.
writing.
Makes sense.
But I think it connects to sort of the book itself in the sense that I'm interested in that, like that deep history. And I think academic writing is really about that slow kind of uncovering of history over time.
Yeah, and I think what comes along with that I think is, one of the we can talk endlessly about the problems with academic writing, and there's definitely problems to talk about. But I think
Right.
something that comes up with that idea is that there's a certain standard that comes with engaging with the sort of machine that is academia in this sense, where I can write a fanzine and I can literally write whatever I want and I can put it in a zine and then send it out into the world, right? But there is, a level of rigor that goes into the process of engaging with any sort of field, any sort of discipline that you're a part of. And again, like that is not it is not a perfect space to be in. Peer review isn't a perfect thing. We can talk about gatekeeping of certain approaches, ways of viewing the world, knowledges, like types of things like that. But it also, at the end of the day, it also just keeps you in check, that you have to like engage with these ideas that are out in the world and understand how does like the thing that you're thinking about, how is it more than just your own personal experience or your own sort of idea and your own sort of lens that you're engaging with, and how does it actually connect to the broader world, right? I mean, I tell a lot of people that my job as a researcher that I've set out for myself is that I just have to convince people that don't know what noise music is that noise music matters. And that's like all I do, right? I walk into an education conference and I say we should be paying attention to this and these are the reasons why. And I go to, the Punk Scholars Network conference every year and it's like, hey, we should also like look at noise music too. And it's an easier sell than in most education conferences, but it's still this space where it's like we can understand the world through this thing that I care about, and I can make that argument because I'm engaging with all these other ideas that have existed previously as well. So I think that there's something really important about that and fascinating about that, that you can start to think about something like noise music in a different way, which is not to say that like you need to have all this academic understanding to understand noise. No, you don't. Like,
Right.
I mean,
Sure.
that would be a ridiculous claim.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's able to sort of like make that switch, I think is interesting, right? To think
Mhm.
about like, oh, I can understand noise in this very visceral, immediate, embodied way,
Mhm.
or I can also like start to theorize it, and I can start to think about it and intellectualize it in a way
Mhm.
that allows different understandings from that music to emerge, and something that at times is so simple and it's so immediate, but there's also so many different layers that sort of come in with that sort of engagement that we have with the
Right.
genre as well.
It's interesting to hear you say that, sort of bringing noise music, your job is to make people understand noise music matters. I mean, I work in an English department, and so my job is to sort of make people know that poetry matters, but that's
Mhm.
Hmm.
less of a hard sell, right? Because
Right.
there's already sort of this whole sort of official world around a poetry that is not there for noise music. And so what's interesting to me is sort of like to bring some of that visceral, unmediated quality that one has to sort of like step back from to a world where oftentimes people feel like, oh, poetry, it's too much, it's already too fancy or too
Right.
this or that, right? And so for me, a big part of the project of bringing noise and poetry together specifically is to kind of break down some of that sense of a gate-kept world of
Mhm.
poetic making through the kind of fact that, within popular music, but also within like all these or older avant-garde practices, the whole idea was to like just make everybody make it available to everybody,
Sure. Sure.
Hmm.
and people might disagree with that, but like I think that it is truly about sort of creating this democratic space. And so how do you kind of latch into that and bring that into either these other institutionalized spaces as I think really important.
Yeah, I mean, what you guys are both saying led me to think about the part of Peter's book that's a good section of it, and most of the end is concerned with sort of the diversity and the fact that there's a white maleness to noise. And one of your strongest points, I think, is that it's an open scene somewhat, and yet still it's all mostly white male. And why is that? And it seems like an academic approach like you took, where you're really thinking through as much as you can about why is this the case. Definitely, that does not happen in a fanzine. And that's
No.
and that's kind of like the visceral reaction to noise is like, well, I'm not even noticing there's all white guys here. I'm just getting into this music. Whereas, so I thought that was a really strong thing. Was that something that was part of your idea for the book to begin with, or did that occur to you as you were doing your research as something that needed to be explored so deeply? Or?
Yeah, it's definitely something that was like a space that I was in and I was thinking
Mhm.
about, right? Because
Mhm.
talking about whiteness and doing critical whiteness studies and that sort of thing, like that's
Mhm.
one of the directions that I go in. That really came out of my work as a promoter and as a musician too. I spent years setting up shows in Milwaukee, spent years setting up fests. I ran the Milwaukee Noise Fest
Mhm.
for about 8 years before going off to grad school. And when I had that time away from being in Milwaukee and wasn't like setting up shows and having a time to reflect and being at a different space in a different city and seeing how they did things there and just sort of like realizing, oh, this is like, I'm falling into a status quo that's here. And so understanding like how that happened and why that happened, I think was,
Mhm.
from a personal perspective, that was just really interesting to me. But also part of it is this idea of engaging with the many layers of contradiction and ambiguity and complication that come with noise music too, and trying to just be really honest about that in a
Mhm.
lot of ways. And so, I do think about that writing, like, what do we do with the fact that noise music is a place that brethren can exist? Like,
Mhm.
what do we do with the fact that Condom is releasing tapes called Calling All Aryans and things like that? And how do we actually navigate that sort of thing? Because it also is a space for empowerment too. I talk about noise music being perceived and positioned as sort of a white dude genre, but that's not necessarily true. You look at like the amount of queer and trans noise music that's like been exploding in the past decade. You look at
Right.
the ways that noise has changed demographically. You look at all of the
Mhm.
amazing artists that are people of color and people that are coming from all different backgrounds, and it is a space that's there. And sort of my question that I was sort of asking myself in the book was just like, what do we do with this?
Mhm.
How do we
Mhm.
make sense of this? Like this none of this makes any sense if you actually try to hold it all at the same time. So how can we start to do that? So, kind of going back to that process thing, like when I first submitted the book, I'd submitted it to a completely different publisher, and once it got to the reviewers, it got rejected. And one of the big things they said was like, well, you're not talking about the structural issues that are leading
Mm.
to noise being a white dude space. And it's like,
Mm.
yeah, that's like an important thing, right? There
Mhm.
are these structural issues that I don't get into the book at all because I don't have the data, because I don't have the
Right.
background, because I can't
Right.
really talk to those things. But
Hmm.
also
Mm.
there's this part of the sort of theoretical aspects of making noise music and the ways that this cultural space has been constructed that we have to really, really grapple with. And yeah, so just like trying to make sense of that and trying to just understand that in a way, it just felt really
Hmm.
important to like not
Hmm.
put something out there that was just ignoring all of these issues that exist
Right.
within noise music.
Sure.
It's
Yep.
just trying to be honest about that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it totally makes sense. John, did you kind of working off that a little bit? Did you do your experience also as a you put on shows here now? I'm not sure if you were doing that as much at the time when you wrote the book, but you were getting into being somewhat of a performer and a musician and a organizer and things like that. What do you think of that helped inform writing the book?
Oh, I mean, and just to sort of go off what Peter was saying too, I think that like one of the big things that, the question around whiteness and noise music that you call up in the book, which I think is really interesting, Peter, is the question of how Afro-diasporic musics are in many ways like parallel
Mm,
with and in relation in conversation with noise music, and that in fact theorizing the kind of embodied knowledge that emerges out of noise music is very much connected to a whole history of Afro-diasporic music that like is running through 19th, 20th, 21st century all the way through back to the 17th century in
mhm,
the US American context anyways. And that I think that one of the questions that this calls up for me is sort of the question of sort of the multiplicity of genres and the ways that sort of noise music both is and is not a genre, both is
Hmm.
in contiguity with even like early rock and roll. So like in my book, noise pops up in talking about Chuck Berry and Little Richard,
Right.
sort of the
Uh-huh.
vocalizations and the forms of like black radical possibility that we read there, that we hear there, and that then carry on and pass on into other sort of forms. And so just to get to the question you asked me more specifically is yeah, as a performer, as someone who has kind of in multi genres, from singing singer-songwriter stuff, but then also to thinking more about power electronics and extended vocal technique. That sort of work of like making sound and trying to embody this knowledge very much informed the ways that I'm thinking about noise throughout its history. Whether that comes into a question of, well, you know, really dorky questions of rhyme and meter,
Uh-huh.
you know,
Uh-huh.
and playing with, caesuras and things like that. To sort of thinking very explicitly about, sound poetry, whether they're Dada sound poetries or Tracy Morris, contemporary sound poet, sort of taking up those questions in a Black radical tradition, and that how is it that my own performance values are connected to that long history has like always been something on my mind.
Cool, cool. It's interesting that you bring up the Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and I think is Fats Domino's in there too a little bit. I
Yeah,
think is
yeah.
it, yeah, yeah. And I thought those were interesting. Another really interesting part of your book. I mean, the kind of broader point is that like I think maybe doing an academic book on noise or things related to noise, the cool thing is that you're not kind of bound to like, well, the people in the noise scene are going to tell me this isn't noise or whatever. So you've got those people in there. You've got war poetry, which I didn't expect at all, which is a really interesting perspective on it. And the kind of the broader thing I'm thinking of, because one of the things I was thinking when I was thinking about talking to you guys is like I like the way each of your books doesn't over define noise, and you kind of leave it open enough to bring in things that are interesting that people might not think about. And so I'm curious how much you felt like, do I need to be defining noise more? In a way, I feel like both books are kind of like long definitions of noise because they're talking about it in different ways so many times that by the end of the book, well, you should have an idea of what they think of noise rather than you having to say in the chapter one, noise is a music that blah blah, or noise in poetry means this, or. But I'm just curious, is that an interesting thing to struggle with? I'm sure it must have been a little bit of like how much do I want to define this versus how much do I want to leave it open?
Peter, I loved your begin. You're dealing with this by going to the Friends.
Yeah.
It was so funny going back through the proofs and realizing that the first
Uh,
noise artist that I talk about in the book is Ross from Friends. I don't
Yeah.
mention a single noise artist before I get to that point. Um,
right.
I don't know. I think it's really interesting because, part of the writing of this book for me was to try to challenge myself to engage with sort of academic writing in a way that can actually embody some of the noisier aspects of the things that I'm talking about, right? That
Mm,
I mean, I can crank out a journal article in a heartbeat that like follows the same patterns and stays, more traditionally bound to the disciplines that I'm a part of. And I did that with some of the things that from my dissertation too, but I wanted to
mm,
sort of engage with this idea of like, how do we make this writing noisier in a way that does the same thing that noise music does when people watch it,
mm,
right? It's not about, I'm going to tell you something through the music that I'm making. Instead, the meaning
mm,
that's being made is through this engagement with work that happens. So how can I sort of
right.
position this book in a way where I am making an argument, but also I'm creating the environment where people can like build sort of these ideas of noise out of it as well.
Mm,
So I think there was
mm,
part of it was sort of my intention with leaving it open-ended. I think the other thing too is just that like how am I gonna make a better definition of noise music than what exists already? Like
right.
like there's almost
Mhm,
like an entire chapter where I'm just like, let's take a look at what everybody else has said because there are
right.
wonderful ways of thinking about it,
Mhm,
and ways in which these artists or not artists, these authors are contradicting each other, and that I don't want to resolve the conflict, right? Because if you start to
mhm,
pull from these different ideas and think about noise through these different ideas, you can really engage with some fascinating sort of ways of being in the world and making art and thinking
mhm,
about communication and things like that too. So yeah, I'm not going to make a better definition. So how can I define it enough for me to think about the things that I want to think about and move on
mhm,
from there?
That's what I really loved about the book, Peter, is that the empirical specificity. um, as as a poetry person, as a kind of
mhm,
literary historian, the empirical specificity is all in these texts or in the audio, and so I'm not sort of embedded in the scene. You're not going to find me, Mark. There's no YouTube video of me reading Wilfred
Charles
Owen,
Olson or yeah.
Charles Olson.
Yeah.
But there maybe there's something out there. I don't know, but
Right.
so it's kind of interesting, sort of thinking, about that as a method for you to say, sort of like, well, I'm not going to define noise music beforehand. I'm just going to talk about what people who are making noise music are doing, and I think that that's
Mhm,
a really like a powerful like methodological statement, and
mhm,
for me, the way that I get into a similar kind of space is that the call of the book really is to sort of say, noise both is and is not. And now I've gotten way too abstract immediately, but that's to say that, like, that we're always sort of changing our listening practices. And that those listening practices are sort of framing and perceiving the world in particular kinds of ways, and that what poets
mhm,
and these noise artists, I'm suggesting, are doing sort of shifting that frame constantly. And so to sort of see the book as a whole definition of noise is really nice, Mark, because it's really
mhm,
like, how is it that they are literally making noise by making the conditions for listening that would say this is noise versus that being noise, and then oftentimes diving into the thing that is the noise side, right?
uh-huh.
Not trying to sort of cordon it off and like keep it
Mhm,
separate. Similar,
mhm,
I think noise musicians intuitively, like contemporary noise musicians inside of scenes, are intuitively doing that. And so we can't
mhm,
sort of say, oh, this is the precise like structural definition that they have or something, but rather it is an action. Similarly, I think
mhm,
all these poets are intuitively doing that work over time. You won't find
mhm,
many manifestos of noise except for, like, Luigi Russolo, the futurists, but
mhm,
like they're not sort of explicitly saying, I am making noise now. Rather, they're sort of inside of those kind of different structures of listening that make noise. And those things are, terms of like media decay, in terms of
Mhm.
semantic meaning, in
Mhm.
terms of audio and oral difficulty. And so I guess like
Right.
another thing, Peter, that I liked about the book is the way that you describe noise versus noise music. Like that
Hmm.
noise is a much more capacious, obviously, sonic thing.
Mhm.
Noise music is a particular kind of genre that's
Mhm.
both is and is not at the same time too, right?
Yeah. I was gonna say I felt like I saw something similar in your work as well, John, that there's sort of these different it's almost like you're talking about noise on like so many different levels in terms of macro and micro and the different scopes that are happening there too. And something that I appreciated so much uh, in reading this and it started to get me thinking about just like how how language is just such a noisy technology in itself. And
Yeah,
so often we think about like the purpose of you go back to that like classic like Bell diagram of like how do you get the communication? There's always going to be noise in the system, but how do you get as much of that communication through it? But the fact is that like you've got the noise in those actual words that are there too. Like the ways that no that words just sound create that sort of noisy interference with by the time you get to that point. And so
yeah,
sort of seeing that argument being made on sort of that really micro level, but then also thinking about like forms of poetry and movements and war and music scenes and all these sort of like larger macro senses where that same noise is sort of playing out at the same time. I thought that was a really beautiful way of just like thinking about like all these different levels of noise that are happening all at the same time. And so, yeah, what noise is and isn't, it's so cool to like read a book like that where it's thinking about all of those things on all those different levels in parallel. So
that's
I liked
awesome.
your book too, is what I'm trying
Thanks.
to say.
I'm glad to hear that. Would have been disappointing
Yeah.
if I put you guys together and you hated each other's books. That would have been funny. So, some of what you guys have been talking about makes me think about a question that I often bring up in this podcast, and it's a struggle. I think it's probably a particularly different struggle with academic books, but I think it's still a struggle. Is your intended reader, intended audience in terms of things like how's this book going to read to someone who knows about it already? How's this book going to read to someone who has no idea about it already? And you guys have that second layer of peer review is often well, I don't know. Peer review, I guess, sometimes can be directed toward people who are familiar with the subject, but sometimes it might not be. And both of my books, I kept thinking to myself, I tried to turn this voice off sometimes. It's like, is somebody going to call me out for not including this one little thing that I didn't put in? Somebody who knows everything about no wave or everything about cassette tapes or whatever. At the same
Right.
time, I'm like, can I assume people know who the Sonic Youth is, or do I need to give them a bio before I bring them up in a so how much was that a factor in what you guys were doing when you were thinking about writing your books?
That's a really good question. And obviously in academic writing, you have a different sort of question
Mm-hmm.
of audience, but I also
Mm-hmm.
think that we're at a stage now in academic writing and certainly with academic presses where there's a call to sort of be writers first and sort of within the structure of academia. And so
Mm-hmm.
I certainly know that so like my book is out on Bloomsbury. It's in the sound studies group or
Mm-hmm.
the sound studies section of Bloomsbury's academics side. And so it's not sort of Bloomsbury literature. That's to say that, like, interestingly, like, I felt like as I was writing that my audience was split between folks who are really invested in sound studies as a field, as a sort of interdisciplinary field, to kind
Mm-hmm.
of come to terms with thinking about sound in all of these different ways. And then on the other side of sort of thinking about those literary folks who are thinking, well, what does this tell me about Charles Olson or Susan Howe or many of these poets
Mm-hmm.
that pop up in the book. And so there's this kind of back and forth of like thinking of poetry actually as a sound art that then speaks to sound studies more broadly and the questions
Mm-hmm.
around listening and culture that those folks are thinking, connected with, of course, those folks who are, or again, like poetry readers. All that is within a matrix, I think, of trying to appeal to the folks that are listening to your podcast and the
Yeah.
people out there who are listening to noise music. That I'm
Mm-hmm.
hoping that it also appeals to sort of a broader range. And one thing I've enjoyed doing is actually at shows and stuff. And this may sound very dorky to you, Peter, but like, I do have like copies of the book as
Nice.
part of my merch, and like feeling like the audience are the people who were just at this show, like listening to noise as much as to those sort of academic fields that I was talking about.
Mhm.
I mean, I love that the book is there and you're selling it. Something that's been cool about being in Nottingham for the past couple of years is that there's this interesting sort of overlap between the noise music scene and sort of the poetry scene that's here. So there'll be like poets that show up on like noise shows all the time, which I hadn't seen before. Also cool to kind of be in the same town, hanging out with both Paul Haggerty and Marie Thompson are both here, and I see them at shows all the time
Nice.
too. So
Oh,
for
awesome.
whatever reason, like I don't know why, like Nottingham is suddenly a convergence of like noise
The
music
noise
scholars,
people.
but it is, which
Amazing.
is yeah, and it's kind of great. Um,
That's cool.
yeah, but to go back to the question of like audience and that sort of thing, for me in writing this book, I think I was like thinking about that a lot and just trying to think about like who would actually want this, like who wants this
Hmm.
book and who's going to enjoy it. And for me, a lot
Hmm.
of it was just like I just want to write this book because I want this book to exist and I want to have it like out in the world, which I think made it more difficult to get across the finish line than if I had written something a little more helpful to other people. But I think that's part of the joy of academic writing, right? Is that like
Hmm.
I don't have to write a book that's going to sell copies. Like I never have to worry about
Right.
that. Like it's
Hmm.
it's there, exists in the world that people want it. That's great. But if not, like I didn't sign a contract. I'm not like trying to like sell a million copies of it. It's just this sort of
Right.
weird thing that exists. And so, yeah, and it's sort of this weird kind of combination for me of like, if a noise music person sits down and reads this, I want them to like recognize themselves in it. And I want that to be a part
Hmm.
of what's there. And then also thinking about writing this for an audience of people that are interested in education, research in some capacity, and also thinking about like cultural studies as well, and trying to sort of make the connection between these sort of things to say like, yeah, education research, you should like pay attention to noise music. There's interesting questions that are being brought up if you think about this as an educational space. And then in cultural studies being like, hey, this is like a cultural space that like I don't really have to convince you of, but also maybe paid more attention to like education theory, because one of my beefs with the field is that I don't think they have a good understanding of what pedagogy means, but they like to write about it every once in a while. And so there was like sort of like these things happening in this space and making it like interdisciplinary in those ways. And because of this, like you asked earlier about like how much do I have to think about like explaining noise music or who these people are and things like that. And you can kind of see in the introduction I give like a brief like here's noise in Japan, here's noise in the UK, here's how they sort of combine in the US. Okay, you know enough, let's go. And then after that, it's not about like making a canon of things. I'm not like talking about like the big artists or trying to like make some sort of historical argument because those books have already been written. Instead, it's like what are those albums that are out there in the world that I'm seeing as being resonant with the things that I'm trying to say here? Like what are those things that I'm excited about that I can write and think about in ways and sort of pull those noise music artifacts into this space to discuss. And yeah, and so like not like saying like I have to like tell you the history of noise music. Like, I don't have to like bring up the big hitters or whatever. I don't have to like make another book about Merzbow, like because we've had people that have written those things, but I can write about my friends and I can write about the cool
Hmm.
things that they do that aren't some sort of cultural touchstone, but instead they're just doing cool stuff that I think about a lot.
Hmm.
I think about that set of that of Jack running in place with a bike hanging around his neck. Like,
Yeah.
that was years ago. He did that once. I don't think he even makes noise music anymore, but it was just like such an
Wow.
incredible set that like me and
Hmm.
12 other people saw. And,
Right.
I can bring up that set to any of those 12 people and they're going to talk about it like they were there that day. And so being
Yeah.
able to have a space to do that and like
Hmm.
not having to worry about somebody being like, well, you should have talked about wolf eyes more or whatever it is, like, that's great.
Right.
And if you
Right.
want that book,
Hmm.
go read somebody else's book, but that's not mine.
Right.
And it's
Right.
it's
Right.
great to be able to like not have to worry about that when it's being
Hmm.
Yeah.
published in that way.
Yeah.
That's cool. It's nice. It's nice to hear you say that ultimately you thought this is a book that I'd want to read, that I'd want to make, because that's a very common theme. Very often when I ask people about their audiences, they're like, "I just trusted that if I was interested in it, that's enough reason for it to exist." And that's cool, I think, because ultimately, if you're kind of like trying to cover everybody, you're just going to miss out on more than you're not going to
Mhm.
be specific enough, and you're not going to be universal enough.
Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned there, that for people who haven't seen the book yet, you end certain sections with a study of a specific recording artist and recording, which I thought was a really interesting thing to do, and a fun way to be able to be more specific about what you're talking about. And it brings me to the broader question of like the whole concept of structure and how you guys worked with structuring the books in terms of being able to, make it, especially in academics, I think you probably have a little more pressure to delineate what I'm going to be talking about here and kind of separate the book into chunks that aren't too overlapping or too overflowing. But at the same time, I think you guys both did a good job of like, you didn't just abandon the concepts you had in one chapter when you went into the next chapter. They built on each other, and there was some chronology happening and things like that. Just curious. So this is sort of a general question: how much you thought about structure, how you even went about it. Did either of you do a lot of outlining, and before you did the writing, did you let the writing kind of determine some of the structure? How did all those things go?
Yeah, well, as certainly the chronological person, chronology was obviously a big part of it. I had actually though initially started. It's kind of a funny chronology thing because the Poetics of Noise from Dada to punk, and yet of course it begins not with Dada but with the World War One poets on the
Uh-huh.
Western Front. So yeah, there's kind of two aspects of structure, which is the chronological. I'm
Mhm.
trying to tell a story, tell a history, and that story involves kind of these structural repetitions again around
Mhm.
that question of how is an artist or a set of poets making noise at each of these moments. What are the different kind of conditions around listening, around culture, that then change, and so like there that change, and yet there's also again this sort of call to sort of think about what that making noise at each different period. So it resolved into sort of this six chapter structure because of seeing World War II and information theory, and the total media transformation after World War II as like being a
Mhm.
big break, rather than a
Mhm.
continuity, and sort of then seeing that structure, as a way of then of marking the history. So for me, I didn't sort of outline it that way necessarily, and I think that
Mhm.
there are still aspects of it that kind of trail off, in the sense that there's a continuity that's like unending, um,
Yeah.
but that and it certainly was never thought. I never thought of it in terms of like, oh, this is going to definitely this chapter matches that chapter or something like that.
Mhm.
But looking back on it now, sort of out of the fray of like just getting it done, you see sort of the some of those kind of parallels that pop up, in the book. Yeah, that's sort of
Cool.
structure is like not pre-given, but definitely emerged out of doing the chronology.
Yeah, and I think I had something similar going on too, where not necessarily like it's not a chronological thing for me, but it's also like thinking about
Mhm.
like how do you start to make an arc out of these things, right?
Cool. Mhm.
And so, I mean, the book, there's a lot of different ideas, theories, topics that are there, but there's this sort of general structure of like kind of like starting small and getting big, right? Like what is noise itself? How does that translate into a noise scene? And then how does that engage with like the broader society as well? And
Mhm.
kind of going from this like very individual like theoretical thing and then going into like the social space and building it out from there, which
Mhm.
sort of aligned itself with the sort of arc that I'm thinking about in terms of the sort of liberatory potential of noise as well, right? That if we like
Mhm.
think about noise in this way, there's a liberatory potential, and then if you go up into like the noise scene, then what does that actually look like in practice? But then when that's actually like looks at noise music as a whole, then what are the sort of failures that are there? Like why doesn't this actually work? And so you can kind of see that sort of arc that's sort of being put in place there. And I think that was
Mhm.
really
Mhm.
important for me to sort of have that idea laid out before getting into it, just because I knew I wanted this book to be kind of wild in terms of like, I'm going to pull from everything, right? Like, I do not care about disciplinary boundaries. I don't want this to be a book that sort of follows or falls into like one specific category. I just kind of wanted it to be like, some sort of like wild thing just because I I wanted it to. I don't know, it just seemed like it was going to be fun to write that way. But I knew that like if it was just 8 billion different theorists piled on top of each other, it wasn't going to work. So it needed like at least some sort of basis to actually follow along. Like, why would I actually want to read chapter two after I read chapter one?
Right.
If and like, section one is like really focused on Deleuze and Freire and Rancière and these like theorists. And then you jump into chapter two or the part two, and it's like, bam, we're talking about post-humanism and we're talking about like hardcore educational theory. And then we're going to do a
Mhm.
critical race theory thing after that. And like, if there isn't some sort of through line or connecting idea that sort of guides you through those things, then it doesn't make sense to have it be a book. Like each of those could have been a journal article or whatever it is. But
Right, right.
yeah, having this sort of book structure allows to make a sort of bigger argument and sort of have just a fuller picture of what this thing actually is, and
Mhm.
having that sort of affordance to be able to talk to those bigger ideas, which yeah, it felt like I wanted to be able to do that, and instead of just making
Mhm.
these sort of micro arguments along the way.
Oh, cool. That makes sense. We've touched a little bit on the peer review process, but I'd be interested to see or hear a little bit more about it specifically in terms of, especially getting the book to the finish line and things like that. How many review and passes kind of things did you go through, either with other people or just on your own? And how what were the expected? Do publishers have expectations in terms of, like, if you get a peer review, you have to show them how you've responded to these questions. You have to show them in the text. You have to make sure you do it, or some were you able to say, well, that's a good point, but I don't think it's going to work in my book, and so I reject that that comment? Or I'm just curious, and also in the broader question of, like, how do you guys revise on your own in terms of just like sitting down? How often do you read through the book and say, and when do you decide you're done, and all those kind of things?
Oof, yeah.
So my process was fucking wild.
Yeah,
I'll
great.
tell you this. Yeah. So, I mean, this book for me, there were parts of the book that I first wrote for my prelims, which meant the first words that showed up in this book were 2018 or 2017, and the
Oh,
book
wow.
just came out in January, right? So this has been a
Right.
while. But I did those prelims. A bunch of that stuff showed up in the book, so I had my committee was looking at that. Then it turns into a PhD, the dissertation. So I have my committee that's looking at those as well. Chapter four, I had originally written as a journal article that got sent to peer reviews that had gotten rejected uh, in a different form. It didn't quite fit the standard social sciences form that was there. So I was able to like bring it into sort of this weird interdisciplinary space that I was in. So that finishes. I've got a couple of chapters from my book that I turned into articles. So I sort of put it to the side, and then I come back to like making this the whole book that's there. And so I put together the proposal for the book and I sent it off to the first people. And they sit on the proposal for, I think it's like 13 months or something like that. Like it's
Wow.
it's a long time. And I'm
Uh-huh.
kind of like responding, like sending maybe every month, like to the editors, just like, hey, what's going on? What's going on? They're like, oh, the editorial board's going to get to it. I finally get a response from the board, and they're like, hey, sorry that we didn't get to this earlier. We had gotten a proposal for a different book about noise music and was really bad, and we thought that your book was that one. And I was
Oh my
like,
God.
yeah. And so I was like,
Wow.
okay. Uh, and then, but they gave me the feedback on the book, and they were just like,
Mm,
hey, this is, great. You should probably be thinking about these couple of people that you haven't included in there,
mm,
which was great because as somebody that came up through education schools, that's in an education school right now, I'm getting this like wonderful sort of learning experience where people are like, these are important books within popular music and cultural studies that you should be looking to. So like that's sort of
mm,
how I can enter that space. But yeah, so then I sent that in, and in the proposal, as I'm writing this, I'm like, hey, I'm going to use some ethnographic stuff. This is not an ethnography; it's an interdisciplinary thing. I'm pulling from a lot of stuff, and the board was fine with it, right? Then they sent that in. I finished writing the book. I send the full book in. It gets to the reviewers, and basically it gets rejected because they were just like, this wasn't an ethnography and it should have been. And I was like, I
mm,
told you up front it wasn't going to be an ethnography. Why did it get accepted in that form in the first place, right? So that whole first part of getting that book read and rejected was like probably it was a close to a 2 year ordeal of just like going through that process and
Wow.
having to do it.
Hmm.
Then, I sat on it for a while and then started to try to like find like another publisher or whatever. And yeah, I got to Palgrave Macmillan partly just because so this was actually so I was presenting at a different conference with my younger brother who's also a academic who writes about punk
Oh,
music, and
oh,
Robin
cool.
James from
Hmm.
Palgrave, who's a wonderful art or wonderful author in her own right,
Hmm. Hmm.
was obviously just like looking for people to do stuff. And she saw the panel that we were on, and they were like, "Do you want to turn this panel into a book?" And we're just like, "Okay, we can do that." And so that's sort of, Palgrave gets on my on sort of my radar. I go to a conference where Palgrave is presenting, and I'm like, "Hey, I'd like to submit this as an education book." And the education editor goes, "It's not an education book; it's a book about music. So why don't you talk to this wonderful editor, Robin James?" And I was like, "Oh, we've already been talking. Great." Um, which really worked out well because I think she really just understood the project and understood the value of
Hmm.
it, and was sort of an advocate for that was there. Yeah,
Hmm.
and that went through a very different review process. Got some nice reviews from there. Difference from like a small university press to like a publisher that's owned by Springer, so it's this like weird
Hmm.
machine that it's a part of. But yeah, so it was a journey, man. It was like
Sounds like
such
it,
a
yeah.
yeah, just like so many like just like
Uh,
pushing and fighting for this book to come out, and I'm just like,
uh,
it's only been out for about a month and a half at this point, but I'm just like
yeah.
so just like
Exhaling.
excited for it to be there and to never have to like look at
Yeah.
it again, and like have I've read that book 50 times or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, but
That
it
that
got
that
there
time.
and it got there. Go for it.
Well, I was just going to say that's the fact that the introduction was written 8 years ago. It reminds me of there's a story of Eraserhead when David Lynch was making it, and he had to like wait years for some of the funding. And there's
Hmm.
actually supposedly there's actually a shot of Jack Nance walking into a room, and the reverse shot of him coming in was shot 5 years after that. After
Wow,
the shot of him walking through the door.
that's incredible.
Yeah, people just don't know sometimes how much goes into
Mm,
stuff like this when you're reading it. But anyway, John,
yeah,
what's your experience with that?
Well, Peter, since it is so fresh, congratulations.
thank you.
I should have said that from the beginning. Yeah, my book came out in 2020, so um, just at a really great time. Yeah.
Yeah.
And similarly to Peter, right? It began as graduate work, dissertation work. Some things there are, yeah, date from 2010, so really,
Mhm.
but as a dissertation that transformed into a book, I actually ended up, I think I almost would have wished to have just written a book completely anew. And that's sort of what I'm doing now is
Mm.
like working on a book on sound poetry and technology and sort of
Oh,
have a
cool.
very bounded sort of like history of
Mhm.
1950 to 1980. Like it's much more
Mhm.
like a less of the loose baggy monster kind of thing. And I think part of that is that, going from dissertation to book, and this is very maybe inside baseball or inside academia kind of stuff, but like I
Mhm.
basically almost every word had to actually change for me
Oh,
anyway.
wow. Mhm.
And yet it's sort of like the same shell. It's sort of like the idea of the house that one keeps building the house
Uh-huh.
is kind of the same, but each part of the house is ultimately become
Uh-huh.
completely different material.
Mhm.
And so it was a process along those lines. The actual process of getting it to press, involved something similar to like what you had, Peter, where I'd go to the literary people at the poetry conferences or MLA conference and be like, "Hey, look at this," and they'd be like, "This is more of a music thing." And then I'd go, and I'd go
Yeah.
to, so like within certain kinds of university press structures at the time, anyway. I think it's different now. Like it felt like, oh, it didn't quite fit anywhere, and so I felt really good about the fact that Bloomsbury, which like Springer, another big machine, sort of
Yeah.
had this sort of academic field sort of already, not just sound studies, right, but sort of specifically noise studies.
Yeah.
With
Mhm.
Paul Hegarty's work, Marie Thompson's work, as you were talking,
Hmm.
your pals in Nottingham,
Yeah.
which is amazing. So like being in that conversation felt really, really good to me, and so sort of pitching it to them that way I was really was great. And then sort of the process of peer review of like sending it out to various people. It felt to me like, like free feedback, you know?
Mm.
It's like there's
Right.
lots of it. Yes, this is some good stuff. And so it was
Mhm.
nice to be able to fold a lot of that into the book,
Mhm.
because, despite the fact that academia is so oriented around peer review, I often find that it sometimes does feel a little bit difficult to get out of the office and, out of the books,
Mhm.
from that stage of like the actual writing to a stage where you feel like, okay, it's ready to be published. Because I think that
Mhm.
oftentimes you don't have a lot of that free feedback, you don't have a lot of that free flow.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
creating, and this is, creating sort of writing groups and things like that is, on the one hand, like that's what we should be doing. We should be like working together and writing together. And we always talk about that. But then on the other hand, I think, Peter, you're probably experiencing this too, like, thrown into the machine where there's suddenly all this extra administrative work and
Yeah.
these kinds
Mhm.
of like bureaucratic elements. And suddenly sort of that the kind of space that academia builds for you to be creative, to be thinking, to be researching kind of starts to get shrunk by kind of all the other stuff that goes along with it. And
Mhm.
so actually putting the book out was sort of like, oh, I do want that peer review to tell me, oh, this is a positive, or this is a thing. Yeah,
Right.
I'm learning something here. So that felt
Mhm.
good.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think that's a in general an issue with almost every kind of book that gets written is like, are you get able to get any kind of outside perspective? Because once you're it doesn't even you don't even have to have finished a draft and you're already too close to the
Yeah.
subject to understand what it would be like for anybody else to read it, and then you just have
Mhm.
to sort of cross your fingers. But peer review can help that because at least it's a forced situation. Like I definitely have had times when people have approached me like, "You want me to read your book before you send it in? I could give you," and I'm like, "Well, but then you might want me to change some of it, so no, I don't want
Right.
you."
Yeah.
but that kind of brings me to a sort of a thing we can end on a little bit is when you are in the middle of writing a book like this. I mean, any book, but especially academic book that gets very specific about certain things. It's not like you can, go to like a hang out with somebody and be like, oh, by the way, today I wrote about this and this and this, and they're going to have any clue what you're talking about usually. So it can be a solitary kind of like in your head kind of existence. And I'm just curious. I think because of that, I think people might who haven't done it before might think it's a bit of a slog. But I think you guys have expressed through what you've answered here that you both were very enthusiastic about it, both really liked doing it. I'm just curious, what are some of the fun things about writing books in general, or writing these specific books? What are some examples you can think of when you thought, wow, that was a fun day today that I worked on my book? I mean, I'm sure there's some days you're like, fuck, I didn't get enough done or whatever. But just curious if you have any specific ways to express how enjoyable the process can be.
Oh, I mean, for me, like the best thing is that I just get to like, if I'm sitting there writing about noise music and this specific noise music that I'm writing about, I get to sit there and just listen to that music all day, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
that's cool. Uh-huh.
that just like rules, and like that's like I'm able to like do that and to be able
Hmm.
to have the sort of space to like sit down and articulate like this is
Hmm.
why this is exciting to me and this is why it's important to me and this is why I like this thing and this is like
Hmm.
where I think if there's value in this space. Just like having the ability to like kind of do that stuff is it's just
Hmm.
great. So I think that's really awesome. The other thing too is like being somebody that does qualitative research and somebody that gets to do interviews, and specifically in a space where it's like my interview participants are my friends, right? Like, of
Hmm.
the 16 or 17 people in the book, like I'd probably known pretty personally at least like 12 or 13 of them. Like there was a couple
Hmm.
people that I flew out for the workshops and that was the first time that we met. But like also there was
Hmm.
just so many of them that were just my friends, and like I get to interview them. I get to like ask them about the things that they
Hmm.
like, and we get to talk about these things for 2 hours straight, and then we get to do
Hmm.
play a show together, and then we get to hang out after the show and then talk about like what was exciting and cool and all these types of things. Like
Yeah.
that's just wonderful, right? Like that's just
Hmm.
such like a
Hmm.
wonderful thing to be able to do. And so
Hmm.
I'm really grateful about that sort of stuff. And it can become a slog once you get into like the editing and the revisions and the
Right.
all that sort of stuff. Like that stuff is like
Sure.
it's legitimately hard and it's like
Mhm.
exhausting and all those things. But at the end of the day, I get to talk about my friends and I get to talk about music I like, and it's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, yeah, we shouldn't undersell
Mhm.
the sloggy.
Yeah.
Right, right.
There's, or underplay the sloggy, I mean to say.
Hmm.
That's to say that,
Hmm.
any kind of like big book like this is going to require that kind of both, again, like in the mud kind of midst of like just digging,
Hmm.
burrowing in, and the big picture stuff, and sort of moves toggling back and forth between those things and being like, oh, did I just say that exact same sentence like
Right,
20 pages
right.
ago? Like that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
It's like
Hmm.
is kind of is intense. And then it's of course also, and I think for any creative practice, depending on how you get into it, right, it can sometimes be difficult just to kind of get things started. So for me, like the
Hmm.
best parts of writing the book were when I was truly in the kind of flow, but the flow
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
oftentimes sometimes caused by the pressure of like a deadline or the pressure, and so like the kind of pressure of the slogginess of that was also a benefit in the sense that when I was really in the writing flow, that felt like really good, and it felt so like my last chapter is probably where I feel like some of the best work was happening because I felt like I was really enjoying listening to,
Hmm.
things like Florian Hecker's Acid in the Style of David Tudor, and trying to understand it, and having to learn new things in the process of writing about it. And so I've got, 10 books, 20 books, spread all around, and you're trying to sort of
Hmm.
like put all these things together while also just sort of listening to this really intense music that you, on the one hand, just know there's something about it that you just need to be able to, that you want to communicate, and yet also finding the difficulty of communicating that. And that to me felt like, now that you asked me that question, sort of something I really loved about the writing process, and feel like when you're in the writing process, it should be that it should feel that way, the kind of like just
Right.
like you're just really locked in, I guess, with
Hmm.
50 texts around you, and you're doing that. But I think that is also at the same time a slog. That's what's so weird about it.
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
the doing of the work is the work. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think with all kinds of writing, any kind of creative writing, there's this your brain has this thing that wants to say, you don't need to write about it, just experience it. Why are you trying to get so far into it? Just do. And you have to break through that part of your brain to get to some of the insights and some things you hadn't thought about before. And that's not necessarily fun because your brain's just like, just shut up and listen to the music or whatever. But there's times when it's good to do that, but there's rewards at busting through that barrier for
Mhm.
sure. Cool. Well, this has been awesome. Thanks so much, guys, for talking. And I'm sure we could have done another hour on this. Maybe we will someday, or when your next books come out, or whatever.
I have more questions. Yeah, thank you so much for this, Mark, and thanks,
Oh,
Peter.
sure.
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
great. I appreciate it.
The Music Book Podcast is produced, edited, and hosted by Marc Masters. Our theme music is by the great band Savak. Our logo was designed by Walter Carlton. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a rating and a review wherever you hear it. And thanks so much for listening.